Blessings be unto you. I pray that all is well. I'm back with another installment for the enslaved. And the title of this video is For the Enslaved. April Fool's Day was churlish. Of course, we're going to start off with the origin and history of April Fool's Day. I have a lot to cover with that. Then we're going to talk about what it meant to the enslaved, and I hope you enjoy. The first entry is from an informant by the name of Kenneth M. Price, and he wrote a book titled Whitman in Washington. And on page 10, it states, "The calendar day we have been considering has a further implication. Mark Twain famously said, April 1st, this is the day upon which we are reminded of what we are on the other 364. April Fool's Day is, of course, a day of pranks and jokes that has its origins in the shift to the new Gregorian calendar. The day carries with it a carnivalesque tradition of an overturned social order and new possibilities for the underclass, all of which is implied in Whitman's description of these half-amusing, half-unnerving young women. In a year of monumental change, April 1st, 1863, is another marker for new beginnings and transformations that Whitman greets with mixed feelings." The next entry is by Harry Oliver. He wrote a book titled Black Cats and April Fools, Origins of Old Wives' Tales and Superstitions in Our Daily Lives. He goes on to say on page 252, April Fool's Day. April is traditionally a day for playing practical jokes on friends and family and sending them on pointless fool's errands. If carried out before midday, the victim of an April Fool's hoax should take it in good spirit for fear of bad luck. But if it is done in the afternoon, the perpetrator is the one who will be unlucky. One explanation for this strange custom is that prior to the transition to our modern calendar in the 16th century, New Year's celebration took place on the first day of April. Confusion must have been common after the change, and in France it became a custom to exploit this by visiting neighbors' houses on the 1st of April and fooling them into thinking it was still the first day of the year. These gullible people would then become the April Fool. Other superstitions dictate that marriage on this day is inadvisable for a man, as he will be a hen-picked husband. To be born on this day is generally fortune, although those with the 1st of April as their date of birth or birthday should be careful not to take up gambling superstitions. Our next informants are Gregory S. and Alicia Aldrete, and their book titled The Long Shadow of Antiquity, What Have the Greeks and Romans Done for Us? They say April Fools, known to us all as All Fool's Day or April Fool's Day, and a time for tricking people, was for the Romans the Vernalia, a festival of Venus, the goddess of love and sex. A note on the Praenestine calendar says that at the Vernalia, women in crowds supplicate Fortuna Virilis, and women of humbler rank do this even in the baths, because in them men expose that part of the body by which the favor of women is sought. Fortuna was likely a goddess of fertility, as well as of luck or fortune. Women of higher rank were said to worship Venus. Ovid mentioned that women offered incense to Fortuna Virilis when entering the baths, so that if the goddess saw any blemishes on them, she would conceal these from the men. Also worshipped on April 1st was Venus Verticordia, the changer of hearts, an aspect of the goddess. While today, April 1st is about fooling people in general, the Roman holiday seems to have been about fooling men in particular into falling in love with or having sex with women whose flaws were hidden by goddesses. Our next informant is Victoria Kidwell, and in her book, Assemblies Made Easy, she talks about April Fools. It's the Hindu festival of Holi or either Holi. Sometimes the celebrations are completely riotous and involve squirting others with water, colored paints, or dyes. This is supposed to symbolize fertility and springtime. There is another connection with the god Krishna, who was rather partial to practical jokes and allegedly a milkmaid threw dye over him. You could draw a connection with April Fool's Day. Our next informant is Mr. William Pullen, and he titles his book The Etymological Compendium or Portfolio of Origins and Inventions, containing a particular account of London and its public buildings. He writes, April Fool. April the 1st stands marked by custom rules, a day for making and for being fools. But say, what custom or what rule supplies a day for making or for being wise? It has been very often inquired from whence this custom was derived. The editor believes it to be a custom of great antiquity. The ancients had many rites and ceremonies in honor of their gods. The Romans kept their Saturnalia in honor of Saturn, beginning on the 17th of December, which lasted during 5 days. Boracus is of opinion they took their origins from Noah's drunkenness. These were times when all business ceased except cooking, when servants might command their masters and slaves become unruly without fear of punishment. The Bacchanal, or feast in honor of Bacchus, lasted 3 days and commenced after the vine harvest, and then drunkenness was the privilege of all. The Saturnalia were confined to 1 day, the 1st of April, when the idiots had their annual holiday and when the children were encouraged to make derision of them and send them on needless errands. Some writers are of opinion that the Romans had much policy in allowing these feasts or holidays. By the first Saturnalia, they saw how servants and slaves would act had they power. By the second Bacchanalia, they were able to discover that the natural inclinations and vices of all that inebriated themselves, and the encouragement they gave to children in the third instance, Saturnalia, to deride fools, would they hoped make them desirous to receive their education, lest they might in time become themselves objects of derision and contempt. Lastly, a book titled Advanced English Audiovisual Speaking Tutorial. I'm not sure of the author, but it goes to explain. The 10th is April 1st, April Fool's Day, a day to play tricks on unsuspecting friends, much like in the 1500s when New Year's Day was first changed from April 1st to January 1st. Now that we've covered the origin of April Fool's Day, I'm going to talk about what it meant to the enslaved. Leona W. Smith writes in her book, St. Landry, Up from Slavery, Then Came the Fire. In the early years of Ossadia Parish, as in most of the state, blacks had problems with prejudice. One of the things most memorable was of the sheriffs in a small rural area that the family knew about in the early to mid 1900s. Sorry about that. The sheriff would drive down the back roads and almost run over anyone in sight. If they were close enough, he would spit on the children and grown-ups alike. He had no respect for blacks at all. His frequent use of bad language to intimidate the folks was totally unnecessary and very tactless. It was as though he felt that blacks didn't have brains. However, all of the black community, and probably some of his white folks too, did have the opportunity to get a laugh in on him. One of the cousins to the family and two other boys were just walking down the road to go to a store in the area when the bully stopped them. They were told for no apparent reason that they had to appear in court on the following week. He, not knowing how to read or write himself, asked one of the boys to write all of their names down on a slip of paper. On the day court started, when the bailiff was ready to read the supposedly three names, only one name was read off in court, and it was that of the bully. The boy had written his name 3 times, and everyone, including the judge, laughed their heads off. April Fool was on him that time. The truth of the matter was that ignorance and lack of education is a sad thing for people of any race or color. The boy in this incident knew how to read and write, but every black at that time did not have the opportunity to get any type of education at all. In another area, 2 men were running for the office of mayor, and one black man was campaigning for the more educated white man and seemingly better candidate. He was found out by the opposition and was ordered to be brought to the courthouse by a group of policemen. The less worthy opponent for the office stood on the steps, which was almost as tall as a man, and kicked the black man's front teeth out. It was hard in those days. Mr. Morris Julian said that April Fool jokes were played on a relative of his back then because he didn't know how to read. The man would be sent with a note from the man he worked for to a merchant in town, and they in turn sent him from one merchant to the next until they got tired and sent him back home. The note that he carried said, "Keep him going." This very type of thing was one reason Mary Esther desired so desperately for her children to get a good education. That's very similar to the origins when they would send children on pointless errands. Roy F. Baumeister, PhD, writes in his book titled Evil Inside: Human Violence and Cruelty. Like a fraternity, the Klan put new members through elaborate hazing rituals and enjoyed some good laughs at their expense. These amusements were not enough to keep the organization going. However, possibly because there were not enough initiation ceremonies to take up all their time, and so the young men hit upon the idea of playing their pranks on outsiders, especially black people, most of whom were recently freed slaves with little education and little familiarity with such humor. Early Klan stories described with great hilarity how the members would pretend to be ghosts or spooks and thereby frighten the gullible, unsuspecting black citizens. For example, a member might wear his white sheet over his head and put a phony head on top. At night, he would approach a former slave and then pretend to remove his own head, handing it to the black man and asking him to hold it for a while. Later, the club members would sit around over drinks and laugh about how that silly black man ran off in fright from a ghost who could detach his own head. One of the later sentiments the author stated, "Even today, there are plenty of innocent and friendly pranks that are based on throwing a scare into someone. And what these first Klansmen did was not so different from the modern rituals of Halloween and April Fool's Day, at least in their own estimate and among their friends." While continuing research about the enslaved, I came across an author titled by the name of Miss A.E. Rooks, and her book is titled The Black Joke: The True Story of One Ship's Battle Against the Slave Trade. Now, she said she was reading W.E.D. Du Bois's book titled The Suppression of the Atlantic Slave Trade, written in 1894, when she came across some information about suppression squadrons. So new to her, she started to do some research, and she came across a ship titled given the name The Black Joke, but its original name was called Henrietta. In the book, she writes, the black joke came across the Spanish brigantine Manzarines off Gilneas. Things started out well enough. The two ships were evenly matched in both complement and armament. But the captain of the brigantine, Manuel Alcantara, wasn't interested in a fight, opting instead to make a run for the quickest current to Havana. The black joke was beginning to show some of the wear of its 2 years of continual and vigorous service to the Royal Navy, but it was still more than a match for anything sailing after a 12-hour chase. Coyd had his prize, or almost had it. Alcantara struck his colors and surrendered to boarding, and Coyd sent over a crew that included the black joke's resident medical officer, Lane assistant surgeon to the Sibley, presumably in case any enslaved on board needed immediate care. Subsequent accounts attest to how extraordinarily crowded the Manzarines was, and prize crew boardings could be rather chaotic, subduing the crew, releasing the enslaved from the hold, searching the ship, documenting everything, counting anything that wasn't nailed down. It was a lot. They could be particularly confusing for the enslaved, a sudden cacophony of English, and in this case, Spanish, and perhaps snippets of whatever native African tongues any of the black jokes had picked up during their time in the service, all flying across the deck as the prize crew went about its standard procedures, sometimes with violence, depending on the disposition and sympathies of the sailors. But the Africans on the Manzarines, though unaware of the sailors, though unaware of who had boarded their disgusting prison, as it turned out. The Manzarines had been very busy, and besides being a slaver, was wanted by the U.S. Navy for a piratal activity committed on this very voyage. So it could have been just about anyone, were not in the least confused about their captivity, or their chances of surviving the horrors of the Middle Passage and whatever hell waited on the other side. On the contrary, they had a plan, and at the moment of peak chaos, and with an unseen signal, they rose up and attempted to free themselves. All of this happened on April Fool's Day, 1830, and it's a very long-standing holiday. Finally, let's hear a slave narrative from an enslaved person, and this was with the Federal Writers Project, written in 1976, Slave Narratives from South Carolina. Our enslaved was Mr. Philip Evans. He's an ex-slave, 85 years old. Mr. Evans states, Philip Evans, his wife, Janie, and their crippled son lived together in a 2-room frame house with 1 fireplace. The old woman has been a wet nurse for many white families in Waynesboro. Neither Philip nor his boy can work. The wife nurses occasionally. Philip says, I was born at the General Bratton Cana place, about 6 miles, sort of up a little on the sunrise side of Waynesboro. I hope you're not, contrary to lack, to think it too much against the old slave when I tells you the day. Well, sir, that day was the 1st day of April. But pray, sir, don't write me down a fool, 'cause I born on that particular April Fool Day, 1852. When I gets through with you, I want you to say if that birthday have any effect on this old man's sensibility. Well, family, that is all I have. I hope you enjoyed this installment for the enslaved. April Fool's Day was for the churlish. And with that, I will say have a blessed one. Shalom.